James Holloway spent 22 years in his home, only to be told he had 7 days to leave, all because of a fence. The HOA president, Deborah Whitmore, had been running the neighborhood like her own personal kingdom, crushing anyone who dared to defy her. But just as James prepared to lose everything, a legend walked by, and with a single stare, flipped the entire situation on its head. And trust me, you won't believe how justice was finally served in Oak Ridge Estates. James Holloway never thought he'd find himself in a life-or-death battle over a damn fence. But here he was, standing in his own driveway, gripping a bright red envelope from the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, his knuckles turning white. Final eviction notice. The words burned into his vision, stark and unyielding, like a final judgment carved in stone. His pulse pounded in his ears as he forced himself to read further. Failure to comply with HOA regulations has resulted in the termination of your property rights. His eyes skimmed over the fine print, his mind struggling to process the sheer insanity of it. 7 days. That was all they were giving him. 7 days to pack up his life, say goodbye to 22 years of memories, and walk away from the home he had poured his blood, sweat, and savings into. And all because of a fence. Not some ramshackle rusting mess. Not some neon-colored monstrosity that screamed bad taste. Just a regular, solid 6-foot wooden fence, stained a deep, natural brown. A fence that blended in, that looked better than half the fences in this damn neighborhood. But, according to the HOA, it was against regulation. More specifically, according to Deborah Whitmore, the self-appointed dictator of Oak Ridge Estates, the fence clashed with the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Never mind the fact that half the houses on the next street over had fences just like it. Never mind that Deborah herself had a damn near identical fence behind her house. Hers, of course, was grandfathered in. James hadn't built the fence to be difficult. Last year, the neighborhood had been hit by a string of break-ins. Vandals trashed garages. Thieves rifled through unlocked cars, and in one case, a burglar actually kicked in someone's back door while the family was home. James remembered the night Mrs. Martinez, the elderly widow 2 houses down, had woken up to find a masked man standing in her kitchen at 2 in the morning. She screamed, and by some miracle, he ran. But after that, she never truly felt safe again. The HOA had promised to install security cameras. They never did. They had talked about increasing neighborhood patrols. That never happened either. So James did what any rational, responsible homeowner would do. He took precautions. First, he reinforced his doors, replaced his locks, installed motion-activated lights. But none of it felt secure enough. Not after what had happened to Mrs. Martinez. Not as after the cops had shrugged and said, "We'll make a report, but there's not much we can do." So he built the fence. The very next day, the first violation notice arrived. Unauthorized modification to property. Immediate removal required. Then came the fines. First $500, then $1,000, then $3,000. They stacked up like bricks, crushing him beneath their weight. James had fought back. He filed an appeal. He presented the crime statistics. He pointed out that the HOA had failed to deliver on their own security promises. Every single one of his arguments was denied without discussion. And now they were taking his house. James felt his rage bubble up hot and thick, an inferno he could barely keep contained. This wasn't just about rules. This was personal. His hands trembled as he crushed the eviction notice in his fist. As if she could smell his anger, Deborah Whitmore appeared. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she strutted toward him, clipboard tucked neatly under one arm, her signature smug smirk already in place. Deborah lived for this. Power, control. The thrill of making people bow to her authority. She paused just outside his driveway, tilting her head slightly, like a queen regarding a disobedient peasant. "It's nothing personal, Mr. Holloway," she said smoothly, her voice oozing with mock sympathy. "Rules are rules." James clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. She was going to enjoy this. James had tried everything. The moment he got that final eviction notice, he hit the ground running, desperate for a way out, any way out. First, he called lawyers, one after another, Every single call started the same way. Do you have a retainer? And ended with the same gut-wrenching answer. Too expensive. $5,000 just to get started, 10 to even make a dent. One attorney straight up told him, "Fighting. The HOA is like punching a brick wall, Mr. Holloway. You can try, but you'll break before they do." Next, he went to the county office. His last hope for some kind of intervention. He waited in line for 2 hours, only for some bored clerk to glance at his paperwork and shake his head. "HOA disputes are private matters, sir. We don't have jurisdiction over that," James pressed, pleaded. Wasn't there anything they could do? Couldn't they at least investigate? Wasn't it suspicious that the HOA was forcing people out of their homes over petty infractions? The clerk barely even looked up. "Sorry, sir. HOA rules are binding. Unless there's criminal activity, it's out of our hands." That was it. End of discussion. Next in line. Then he turned to the neighbors, knocking on doors, swallowing his pride, and begging for their support. They all looked away, avoided his eyes, mumbled excuses. "I can't get involved, James. She'll come after us next. I have kids to think about." Deborah had them all wrapped around her damn finger. Decades of petty rule changes, backdoor fines, and carefully targeted HOA lawsuits had broken them. They were too afraid to fight back, too afraid to lose their own homes. And James? He was already lost. The 7-day countdown passed in a blur of stress, dread, and sleepless nights. Each morning brought a fresh reminder taped to his door. Each day the fines increased. Each night he lay awake in his nearly empty house, staring at the ceiling, knowing that in a matter of hours, this place, his place, would no longer belong to him. Then came the final morning. James sat in his porch, his body drained of every last ounce of energy, his face hollow with exhaustion. His fight was over. There was nothing left to do but wait. At exactly 9:17 a.m., he heard it, a moving truck rumbling down the street like a hearse rolling up to collect a body. His body. The HOA had arranged it all, without his consent, of course. They were efficient, he'd give them that. Had to be, when you make a career out of stealing homes. The truck parked in front of his driveway. 2 men hopped out, neither of them looking at James as they popped open the cargo doors. They were already unloading. He was being erased piece by piece. His home, his memories, his entire life, stolen in broad daylight by a bunch of power-hungry suburban bureaucrats who had decided he didn't belong anymore. James's hands shook. He forced them into fists, but it didn't help. Then, someone walked by, not just anyone. James blinked, his exhausted brain refusing to process what he was seeing. The man was tall, lean, weathered. He moved with that slow, deliberate stride that made the world step aside. And that face, lined, familiar, impossibly sharp. No way, no goddamn way. James exhaled, barely whispering the words. Clint. Freaking Eastwood. James blinked hard, his brain struggling to catch up with his eyes. Was he hallucinating? Because there was no way that was who he thought it was. The man, tall, lean, radiating a quiet, deadly presence, strode down the sidewalk like he owned the whole damn neighborhood. His boots hit the pavement with slow, measured steps, like he had all the time in the world, like he had nowhere to be, but everywhere to go. And that face, deep lines etched into sun-worn skin, piercing eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a weathered hat, and that scowl, that unmistakable, world-famous scowl. James's breath caught in his throat. No way. No goddamn way. He wasn't the only one who noticed. The sheriff's deputy, a young guy who looked like he'd never had to deal with anything more serious than a traffic ticket, visibly paled. He straightened up like a cadet caught slacking during inspection. His mouth opened, but it took a second before sound actually came out. Mr. Eastwood? James could see the exact moment the deputy started questioning reality. His face said it all. What the hell is Clint Eastwood doing here? The Clint Eastwood came to a stop in the middle of the street, right between the moving truck and the uniformed men preparing to rip James's life apart. He squinted at the scene in front of him, slow and deliberate, taking it all in. James could feel the air shift. The whole damn street had gone still. The movers, who had been tossing boxes around like they were on a schedule, froze mid-lift. Even Deborah Whitmore, the queen of Oak Ridge Estates and dictator of the HOA, had stopped in her tracks. For the first time in her miserable, power-hungry life, she was speechless. Clint's voice broke the silence. Low, rough, pure gravel, like it had been dragged through 1,000 dusty westerns and left out in the sun to dry. "What's all this?" James swallowed hard. Holy shit, this was real. Still in shock, he forced himself to respond, though his voice barely made it past his lips. "They're, kicking me out, over a fence." He barely got the words out before Clint's scowl deepened, the lines in his face cutting even sharper. His gaze shifted, slow, deliberate, from James to the sheriff. "And you're letting it happen?" The sheriff, a man who had probably never backed down from anyone in his life, actually took a step back. He cleared his throat, straightened his belt, tried to regain control of the situation. "The HOA," he started, but his voice wavered, "has the legal right..." Clint cut him off before he could finish that thought. "This man served?" James blinked again. Was this actually happening? Yeah," he managed. "Navy." The temperature on the street seemed to drop. Clint's face didn't change, didn't twitch, didn't blink, but something in the air shifted, something heavy settling over the neighborhood like a storm cloud ready to break. He turned his head, slow and steady, and locked his gaze onto Deborah Whitmore. She shrank under his stare. James had never seen Deborah look nervous before, but right now, the woman who had spent years terrorizing this neighborhood, the woman who had smiled as she crushed families under fines, rules, and technicalities, looked like she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Clint took a step forward. His voice dropped, low and firm, each word carved out like it weighed a ton. "This man fought for his country, and you're kicking him out over a damn fence?" Silence. Not just quiet. Thick, suffocating, unbearable silence. James could feel it pressing down on the whole damn block. The neighbors, who had been watching from their windows, peeking through blinds, suddenly stopped breathing. Deborah's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. Then Clint Eastwood did something that would go down in Oak Ridge Estates history. Without breaking eye contact, without an ounce of hesitation, he spit right on the pavement, right at Deborah's feet. The sound of it hitting the concrete was like a gunshot in the dead silence. Clint adjusted his coat, eyes still locked on Deborah. "I don't like bullies." His voice was calm, too calm, like a warning before a storm. What happened next felt like something ripped straight out of a Hollywood script. The kind of moment that seemed too perfect, too poetic, too damn legendary to be real. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The sheriff, who had started the morning looking like a man in control, now looked like a man who had just walked into a scene he wasn't prepared for. His posture shifted, shoulders squaring, then dropping slightly, as his eyes darted between Clint Eastwood, Deborah Whitmore, and the growing crowd of onlookers. He took a step back. That was all it took. The moving crew, who had been efficiently dismantling James's life just moments before, hesitated. Their hands gripped boxes that suddenly felt too heavy. One guy glanced at the other, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell them what the hell they were supposed to do now. And then, the murmur started, soft at first, almost a whisper, but it grew. "This ain't right. This could happen to any of us. Deborah's been running this place like a damn dictatorship. More voices, more movement. Blinds that had been half closed were now being pushed open. Doors creaked as neighbors stepped onto their porches, coffee mugs in hand, row belts hastily tied, eyes darting between James, Deborah, the sheriff, and Clint freaking Eastwood. And for the first time in years, James saw something in his neighbor's eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time. A spark. For years, they had all been terrified of Deborah Whitmore, of her power trips, her fines, her endless rules, her ability to ruin lives with a stroke of a pen and a smug little smirk. But now she was silent. Now she was staring down Clint Eastwood, and for the first time in her miserable, power-drunk existence, she wasn't the one holding the cards. Then, Bob Carter stepped forward. Bob, the old, retired lawyer from 2 houses down. Bob, who had spent the last 2 decades watching this HOA tighten its grip on the neighborhood like a snake coiling around its prey, shaking his head but never getting involved. Not until now. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and said, "Actually, the HOA's bylaw enforcement is legally questionable. I can draft an appeal." That was it. That was the match that hit the gasoline. Another voice cut through the air, this time louder. "Hell, let's vote to recall Deborah." Then another and another. "Yeah, let's get her the hell out. She's got to go. We should have done this years ago. She's been robbing us blind." The murmurs turned into shouts. The shouts turned into a movement. The neighbors who had once cowered under Deborah's thumb were now standing together, and she knew it. James could see it in her face, that exact second she realized she had lost. Her lips pressed together, eyes darting to the sheriff, then to the moving crew, then to the HOA representatives standing behind her. But no one came to her rescue. She had ruled this neighborhood with an iron grip for years. Threats, fines, legal loopholes, dirty tricks. But she didn't have a weapon for this. She didn't have a rule to enforce against Clint Eastwood standing in the middle of her perfect little street, making her look like a fool in front of the very people she had spent years terrorizing. James turned to Clint, still half in disbelief. The man just nodded. Once. A simple, silent acknowledgement. "There, you're good now." And then without a single word, Clint Eastwood turned and walked away. Didn't wait for thanks, didn't bask in the moment, didn't need to, because his job here was done. And just like that, he was gone. James couldn't even move, couldn't even process what had just happened. Was he dreaming? Had this really just happened? But as the reality of it settled over him, a slow wave of something electric ran through his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt something other than helplessness. Deborah? She was finished. Within a week, the pressure was too much. She was forced to resign, the HOA board scrambling to contain the fallout. The eviction? Overturned. The fines? Refunded. And the bylaws? Rewritten. To make sure no one could ever pull a stunt like this again, James kept his house and his fence. As for Clint, he never came back. Didn't need to.